All right. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our March Food for Thought. My name is Scotty Kirkland. I'm the Exhibits, Publications, and Programs Coordinator. Happy to offer some announcements and an introduction for you today. Before we get started, just invite you to go ahead and silence those cell phones and remind our online audience that if you have a question for our presenter, you can put that in the chat feature. We will get to those at the end. Just have three announcements for you today before we get started. Tuesday, March 21st at noon, the Archives will host a virtual-only presentation on WHER, which is the nation's first all-female-run radio station. Our speaker will be Hallie Phillips, who is the granddaughter of the station's founders. This is a presentation, of course, that's held in conjunction with our exhibit on the second floor, Alabama Radio Moments. And these presentations are sponsored by the Alabama Humanities Alliance. The following week, and I should say once again that is a virtual-only program on the 21st. The following week, Tuesday, March 28th at noon, we'll host a book talk here in this room and online with Dr. James Brown, who is a professor emeritus of Samford University. Dr. Brown will be speaking on his new book, Distracted by Alabama: Tangled Threads of Natural History, Local History, and Folklore. Finally, our Food for Thought series will continue on Thursday, April the 20th with Victoria Ott, who will discuss themes of family, gender, and power in Confederate Alabama. And Food for Thought, of course, is brought to you by the Friends of the Alabama Archives and this year by the Alabama Humanities Alliance. Our speaker today is Dr. James C. Cobb, a distinguished professor emeritus in history at the University of Georgia. He is the author of more than a dozen books highlighting the economy, politics, and culture of the American South. These include A Way Down South, A History of Southern Identity, and Selling the South, The Southern Crusade for Industrial Development. Dr. Cobb, I had to limit myself to only two, but there were several favorites in there. Throughout his career, Cobb's work has been published as well in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal. He is a former president of the Southern Historical Society and a member of the prestigious Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. And in October of last year, the University of North Carolina Press published Dr. Cobb's newest book, which is a biography of historian C. Vann Woodward. In reviewing the book, David Goldfield noted, "This is not just a book about a prominent historian or the academic profession. This is a book about America and how all of us have come to see our past and how that has changed the present." And it's in that sentiment that we invited Dr. Cobb today to speak with us about Professor Woodward, one of his works, Dr. Martin Luther King, and the Civil Rights Movement. Before we invite Dr. Cobb to the stage, it seems appropriate to point out two things. The first is that we have a case here with a few items from our collection, letters between Professor Woodward and Milo B. Howard, who in 1965 was the reference archivist here and would soon become director. Letters exchanged between those two men during 1965. It also seems appropriate to acknowledge the presence today of Dr. Mills Thornton, who was one of Professor Woodward's many doctoral students at Yale. Dr. Thornton is an award-winning historian and a longtime friend of this agency, and many of the things that you see in Alabama Voices bear his fingerprint. So we are grateful for him, and we are grateful especially that he is here today. So with those two final announcements, Dr. Cobb, you come.
Thank you, Scotty, and thank you all for showing up. The exhibit of the correspondence over there brought back memories to me, because my first visit to the Alabama Archives was in 1978, when Mr. Howard was the director and so I thought about his. He had a rule that at that time that the female members of the staff could not wear pants, and so I was coming looking for stuff for records of the Alabama Development Commission and George Wallace's interactions with him. And so she says, well, we have some of the Wallace papers but they're up there on that top rack. And, since I'm wearing a skirt, I can't go up there, but you're free to go up there and have a look if you'd like. So that left me perched for about 2 hours on the stepladder. My arches have never been the same since, but I had basically a free run through George Wallace's papers at a time when nobody had gotten to them to, sanitize them or do anything else. So it was kind of a curious thing. But I was particularly amused by Mr. Howard's suggestion that he might have gotten C. Vann Woodward, a noted racial liberal, appointed as an honorary state trooper, which would have put him under the titular command of Wallace's main henchman, Colonel Al Lingo. And I can't imagine how amused that letter must have made Woodward when he got it. A great many of you may well be asking yourself why you should be interested in a book about a historian who has been dead for 22 years, written by another historian who looks to be nearly dead himself. In response to your skepticism, I can only say that Comer Vann Woodward is worth reading about, primarily because no other 20th century American historian, or for that matter, no scholar of any other disciplinary stripe, gained such influence and enjoyed such deference and respect within the academic sphere while achieving such prominence outside it. And for that matter, maintained both of that high standing in both quarters for nearly so long. Nor did Woodward acquire or retain his lofty professional stature by steering clear of crises and controversies. A tireless advocate for social justice from his 20s until his 90s, he compiled an astonishing record of direct involvement in crusading for racial integration, defending civil liberties and academic freedom, and combating abuses of power in the highest echelons of government. In this, he revealed a personal commitment to reforming the present that his writings about the past often seemed calculated to inspire in others. Such an expansive record of intellectual achievement and social activism seemed, to say the least, improbable for someone born in rural Arkansas during the first decade of the 20th century, raised in its Klan-infested communities, and educated in its public schools. Nor did his 2 years at a tiny Arkansas Methodist college, or the 2 that followed at another Methodist institution, Emory University, then presided over by the uber-rich and not exactly keen on free-thinking Candler family, seem likely to launch such a career. Unlikely as the prospect of Woodward becoming a social activist had seemed, when he arrived in Atlanta to study at Emory, if anything, the odds against his becoming a historian were even longer. His consuming passion was literature at that point, and it would remain so for a long time, stoked by innumerable late-night sessions with Ernest Hartsock, a talented poet who published his own literary magazine, and Emory debate coach Glenn Rainey, who was also an inspiring writer. Woodward's only exposure to history as a discipline at Emory had come in a single abysmally dull course that had been, in his words, more than sufficient to discourage further curiosity. He performed brilliantly in his classes when the subject matter inspired him, but his selection of courses was seemingly whimsical and random. He received the school's first ever bachelor's degree in philosophy, largely as a consequence of having haphazardly acquired the requisite credits in that field. A few months after graduation, he had stumbled just as unwittingly into a job teaching English at Georgia Tech. Though he had no intention of making a career of it or anything else at that juncture, for the time being, his situation at Tech suited him just fine. With his class preparation down pat, he reported his teaching duties were requiring less and less time, which leaves me leisure for a rather prodigious amount of reading that I am doing. Only after much prodding did he accept a Rosenwald Fund scholarship to pursue a master's degree at Columbia University in 1931. Having admittedly gone to Columbia with little but the vaguest idea of what he was going to do once he got there, it was only after another meander through the curriculum that he settled on writing his MA thesis on Alabama Senator Thomas Heflin. Though it proved to be largely impressionistic and superficial, the thesis did at least plant the germ of an idea of a book on Southern demagogues that would eventually become his biography of the Georgia populist firebrand turned bloodthirsty racial and religious hate monger Thomas E. Watson. After finishing up at Columbia, spending this summer of 1932 in Europe, he returned to his teaching post at Georgia Tech and devoted his spare time to roughing out his book. He was comfortably settled into this routine in the spring of 1933, only to have his reverie shattered when a dramatic Depression-era budget cut cost him his job at Georgia Tech. Though he vowed to make the most of his free time by writing as much as possible, his personal funds were soon exhausted, forcing him to find a way to sustain himself that would also allow him to keep writing. He reluctantly settled on enrolling in the history PhD program at the University of North Carolina, not because he aspired even to earn a degree, much less become a professional historian, but solely out of his need for some sort of fellowship support until he could finish the book. This he managed to do through a friend's ties to famed UNC sociologist Howard Odum, who secured a relatively handsome stipend for him courtesy of the Rockefeller Foundation. Though he found the idea of studying history unappealing from the beginning, the reality of it was even worse than he feared. The surge of originality and imagination that was energizing the Southern literary scene in 1934 was nowhere in evidence among the professors he initially encountered in Chapel Hill. On the contrary, they seemed to see preparing graduate students in Southern history as largely a matter of catechizing them in the accumulated wisdom of their elders, as laid out in musty old volumes written at least a generation earlier and left to languish wholly unrevised in the interim. Plodding through the likes of these, the thoroughly frustrated Woodward wondered if he had ever encountered prose so pedestrian, pages so dull, chapters so void of ideas, whole volumes so wrong-headed or lacking in point. Persuaded that becoming a professional historian meant little more than a lifetime dedicating to inflicting such reading on innocent youth, not to mention himself, he recalls spending many a night during his first semester pacing Chapel Hill's legendary Franklin Street, debating whether I might fare better as a fruit peddler, a gambler, panhandler, or hack writer. Despite complaining constantly that attending classes and mind-numbing reading assignments has thrown his writing on the Watson biography completely behind schedule, Woodward still found time to indulge his passion for literature. Both he and Glenn Rainey immediately devoured anything written by Thomas Wolfe, for whom Woodward later professed such affection that Wolfe's death had caused him personal grief. On the other hand, he harbored no such feelings toward a certain Margaret Mitchell, whose 1936 novel about how a tart little bitch gets all the men in North Georgia in rut triggered such a violent muscular contraction in his esophagus that he was forced to abandon it only 118 pages in. Woodward's intense admiration for the creative imagination of writers like Thomas Wolfe only intensified his disappointment with professors who insisted that a proper historian should master all the factual details of human events before addressing their larger meaning. Thus, his tongue was not entirely in cheek when he complained to Rainey that history, I find, is a collection of facts. Should have looked into that before going so far. Nothing but contempt for facts. Opinion, all that matters. Proper attitude. Even Carlisle Sitterson, who was Woodward's best friend in graduate school, admitted that his chum had little enthusiasm for mastering the bricks and mortar of historical information, and thus simply did not know many facts of history. After cutting classes with abandon and putting off his instructor's assignments until the very last minute, with his formal PhD orals in the offing in the spring of 1936 and the future of his Rockefeller funding on the line, he had no choice but to frantically beg and wheedle notes from his classmates at the last possible second. He made it clear, as one of them put it, that his goal was learning just enough to pass those examinations. By all accounts, the only one of his faculty examiners who thought he even came close to that was his brand new dissertation advisor, Howard Beale. According to legend, at least, Woodward had dismissed questions on topics about which he knew nothing and cared even less by saying something like, "I don't know, I never was very much interested in that." Half that saved him. In any case, he seemed not the least bit humbled by his experience when he claimed the next day after the exam to be indulging myself in the dubious pleasure of some extravagant forgetting. No niggardly date here and dictator there, but whole dynasties at a time. Poof, there go the Habsburgs. Poof, the Hohenzollerns. I made the mistake of forgetting the Hanoverians before the Orals. A continent or two, an ocean of diplomacy, and a library of books. Alcohol provides an excellent solvent for the unused impedimenta of information after examinations. In the end, though, his single-minded focus on completing his Tom Watson biography paid off in a dissertation that was submitted to Macmillan Publishers in May 1937 and appeared less than a year later with scarcely a trace of revision. Despite the favorable response to Tom Watson, Agrarian Rebel, in academic circles, his indifferently acquired PhD in history remained largely an afterthought until a thoroughly deflating report that his book had sold only 559 copies in its first year in print finally shattered his illusion of making a living strictly as an independent biographer. With that, the stage was set for arguably the most pivotal of all the timely and fortuitous twists that were to become the hallmark of his long professional career. Woodward was barely 30 years old in March 1939 when, despite some qualms about his liking his liquor a little better than he should, the editors of the new History of the South series invited him to write Volume 9, encompassing the period 1877 to 1913. After the author originally chosen for the book abruptly withdrew from the project. Owing to the onset of World War II and other delays, the volume would not appear until 1951, although it would soon prove itself worth the wait. The research behind Origins of the New South was massive enough to yield another book, Reunion and Reaction, a boldly revisionist take on the Compromise of 1877, which ostensibly brought down the curtain on Reconstruction. Yet it was Origins, a commanding synthesis of a little explored period that challenged the dominant, thoroughly whitewashed New South historical account of that era, that would quickly establish its author as the leading authority on Southern history since the Civil War. Meanwhile, the book that would fuel Woodward's meteoric ascent to prominence beyond the Academy grew out of 3 hastily written lectures delivered at the University of Virginia in September 1954, scarcely 4 months after the Supreme Court's landmark school segregation ruling in Brown versus Board of Education. The lectures were rushed into print essentially verbatim by Oxford University Press in April 1955 as The Strange Career of Jim Crow. Though they constituted what was to become the most widely read account of American race relations published in the 20th century, Woodward had seized on the lectures as a means of rallying public support for enforcing the Brown decision. To that end, he took issue with the longstanding conviction, even among those who favored integration, that rigid, thoroughgoing racial separation had been an elemental fixture in Southern life far too long to be eradicated by a mere Supreme Court decree. He contended instead that consistent, strictly observed segregation dated back little more than 50 years to the Jim Crow statutes enacted in the 1890s. Before that, he maintained racial interactions in the South had actually been more fluid than most believed. Woodward encouraged readers to believe that as a creation of law in its own right, and a fairly recent one at that, segregation could surely be eliminated by the same means. His thinking, he later explained, was that if he could persuade reluctant would-be activists that racial segregation in the South originated not in ancient habit or custom, but in a legal framework constructed scarcely half a century earlier, they might take hope that segregation was not all that invulnerable. Contrary to what remains a widely embraced legend, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. did not anoint the strange career of Jim Crow as the historical Bible of the civil rights movement when he spoke in Montgomery 58 years ago this month at the end of a 3-day march from the recently bloodied voting rights battleground of Selma. More's the pity for the book's author, who was in the crowd that day, had envisioned it inspiring precisely the sort of devotion to a righteous cause and faith in its fulfillment that such a designation would have implied. Woodward King did invoke the book's central argument when he credited it for showing that racial segregation as a way of life did not come about as a natural result of hatred between the races immediately after the Civil War. There were no laws segregating the races then. He wandered a bit off track, though, in reporting that Woodward had exposed racial segregation as merely a political stratagem contrived by the emerging bourbon interests in the South to keep the Southern masses divided in order to keep their wages low. Intent on thwarting populist efforts in the 1890s to unite the sorely exploited Southerners of both races politically in order to overthrow bourbon rule, King added, the Southern aristocracy began immediately to engineer this development of a segregated society. In reality, Woodward had made no mention of the Bourbons in the book, and he portrayed the Southern aristocracy as reluctant capitulators to de jure segregation rather than its eager architects. Still, despite mangling certain details of his argument and drawing on his book to challenge the legitimacy of segregation and suggest its vulnerability, in 1965, King was at least using it as Woodward had hoped it might be when it appeared 10 years earlier. Whatever its merits as an inspirational track, however, considered purely as a piece of scholarship, the strange career of Jim Crow fell short on several fronts. Not only did its sweeping attack on the traditional assumptions about the origins of segregation rest upon just 8 sources, but Woodward had cherry-picked these sources with such surgical precision that the passages he shared in the text were as often as not contradicted by others, not simply within the same paragraph, but even in adjacent sentences. Such manipulation of sources was hard to detect because the book offered no footnotes. Yet Woodward's dogged insistence that segregation became a fixture of Southern life only with the passage of the Jim Crow laws of the 1890s fairly begged would-be revisionists to document its existence prior to that point. Not surprisingly, a number of them proceeded to do just that. One of the first was Joel Williamson, whose intensive research on the history of race relations in South Carolina led him to challenge Woodward's contention that the state's failure to introduce a law requiring racially separate railroad cars until 1895 reflected a lingering inconsistency in white attitudes toward blacks. On the contrary, Williamson argued, South Carolina whites were uniformly committed to maintaining their dominion over blacks well before emancipation. If anything, Reconstruction had only stiffened their resolve to the point that they had seen little need for a statute to impose a practice that already existed in fact, especially when it might have offended influential elements in the North. By 1970, historians had already punched so many holes in Woodward's thesis that David Hackett Fisher showed no hesitation in declaring it had been proven wrong in all its major parts. The revisionists were by no means done with it at that point, however. In his zeal to fuel popular outrage over segregation, Woodward had presented it as the most brutal and abusive system that whites might have imposed, only to have Howard Rabinowitz point out that blacks likely found it preferable to the wholesale their wholesale exclusion from public spaces and accommodations that had been their fate prior to the passage of the institution of segregation. Later, historians would also contest Woodward's depiction of segregation as a concession to the rabid racism of the rural white masses, noting that it had emerged during a period of rapid urban and industrial expansion that forced blacks and whites into closer proximity than before. Accordingly, it had made its formal legal debut on the railroads as what Edward L. Ayers called a badge of sophisticated, modern, managed race relations, meaning, as John Sell added, that Jim Crow was not born and bred among rednecks in the country. First and foremost, he was a city slicker. In a real, if deeply ironic sense, the true importance of a historian's contribution is measured not simply in how effusively others in the field praise it at the outset, but in how long they deem it relevant enough to warrant their criticism. For the strange career of Jim Crow, this period encompassed at least 3 decades. Such a span would have been remarkable enough for a patiently crafted monograph based on several years of scrupulous research, let alone for a hastily conceived and composed set of lectures, advancing a more sweeping and provocative argument than the evidence provided could possibly justify. Woodward's book was a bold attempt to make the past say precisely what he thought Americans in general needed to say at that particular moment. As such, it was all but certain to draw fire from historians more concerned with the accuracy of what it had to say about the past than with its relevance to the present. Surely no historian did more fundamental damage to the Woodward thesis itself over that 30-year span than Joel Williamson. Yet none was quicker to acknowledge the profound importance of Strange Career of Jim Crow in establishing the history of race relations in America, theretofore largely the province of black scholars, as a rich and vitally important field of inquiry for whites as well. As Howard Rabinowitz added, the scholarly curiosity piqued by Woodward's provocative assault on the traditional wisdom soon led to a host of new findings that transcended the narrower issue of the origin and extent of segregation itself. Regardless of what strange career of Jim Crow's standing among historians after more than 65 years in print may tell us, it is hardly a register of the book's importance outside the scholarly arena, where it reached a vast audience who purchased 1 million copies over more than 2 generations. In a succession of revisions over a 20-year stretch, geared to bringing readers up to date on the ongoing crusade against racial discrimination, Woodward succeeded brilliantly not only in historicizing recent events on the fly, but in weaving them into a brief, readable, and reliable narrative, not necessarily of Jim Crow's beginnings, but certainly of his rise, dominion, and demise. These attributes were not lost on a great number of instructors looking for just such a text to assign to their undergraduates. And after more than 30 years from its publication, Rabinowitz deemed it still the best available brief account of American race relations, noting that Woodward's treatment of relevant events in the 20th century had gone virtually unchallenged. If the strange career of Jim Crow had enjoyed a rather strange career in its own right, surely no less can be said of its author. Well into the 20th century, Southerners writing about their region's past in any genre were expected to hew tightly to the tenets of a highly orthodox historical creed. Its purpose lay in rationalizing the South's current racial, political, and economic system as the most logical and feasible extension of the strategies devised to help it overcome the devastation and havoc wrought by the Civil War and Reconstruction. Between 1938 and 1955, Woodward had challenged this narrative and the sense of legitimacy it conveyed on the present order in 4 books, which, as historian Richard King noted with little exaggeration, collectively revolutionized the established view of Southern history from the end of the Civil War to World War I. This was no small achievement for someone who had once steadfastly rejected even the notion of becoming a historian. Yet, in another striking twist, at age 46, with nearly half his life and 2/3 of what proved to be an extraordinarily long and productive career still before him, the scholar who had just risen to the pinnacle in his field had published his last book-length, originally researched work of history. There would be an abortive attempt at a book on Reconstruction, but going forward, Woodward's written contributions as a historian, arguably some of the greatest he would render, were to come elsewhere, in scores of essays, commentaries, and opinion pieces appearing in widely read publications ranging from the New York Times to the New York Review of Books to Harper's, Newsweek, and Time. A number of these would resurface in published collections of his writings, the best known being the enormously engaging Burden of Southern History, where he deftly explored the nature of both Southern and national identity and the vital importance of each to the other. Though never hesitant to address the South's historic wrongs and enduring flaws, as several essays in this collection reveal, he maintained a powerful and unapologetic emotional attachment to his downtrodden native region and frequently reminded its self-righteous northern critics that their own backyards could use a bit of work themselves. Despite the book's title, its contents offered as many lessons for Americans outside the South as within it, including his precocious warnings about the inherently dangerous presumptions of a peculiar national virtue and invincibility that sustain the mythology of American exceptionalism. These unheeded cautions were borne out repeatedly as the nation endured the tragedy and folly of intervention and escalation in Vietnam, the explosion of wanton racial violence and rage in its central cities, and the humiliation and disillusionment of the Watergate scandal. A comprehensive tally of Woodward's writings aimed at readers outside the traditional academic realm would amount to a veritable laundry list of the critical national and international issues that concerned Americans in general at one point or another over the better part of the 20th century. One might have predicted that at some point, Woodward's growing popular appeal would either undermine his lofty standing among his academic colleagues, or, as it seemed to do with Arthur Schlesinger Jr., encourage Woodward to abandon that calling altogether. Yet, in fact, the effect was just the opposite. After securing a position at Johns Hopkins immediately after the war, he had politely resisted the advances of a formidable procession of ardent academic suitors before Yale came calling with the offer of a prestigious Sterling professorship in 1960. Between Hopkins and Yale, he would direct more than 40 dissertations to completion. Among their authors were 3 future Pulitzer winners, not to mention others who also gained genuine distinction for their contributions. Others have directed more dissertations, certainly, but surely no American historian has managed over a 3-decade span to attract and train a collection of graduate students who, as a group, registered a more substantial impact on their field. Woodward's noted generosity in reading and commenting on the work of dozens of others at various stages in their careers, and his nearly 4-decade tenure as the editor of the multi-volume Oxford History of the United States make it even more difficult to exaggerate his importance to scholarship in American history during the last half of the 20th century and well beyond. Rejecting any suggestion that history has findings and secrets too arcane for the general reader, as editor of the multi-volume Oxford series, he insisted that contributors make their books accessible to such a reader in readable, unspecialized prose he can read and enjoy. He saw the growing tendency among historians to content themselves with sharing their findings only with each other, leading them not so much to lose the public as to simply abandon it. In this respect, surely, current headlines announcing the end of history would seem to harken back to the concerns raised by Woodward some 40 years ago. Extraordinary as the stature he achieved within his own grudgingly chosen profession might be, the broader importance of Woodward's story lies in the insights it offers into major developments and trends in American intellectual life and public affairs for the majority of the 20th century. At the outset of his career, his readiness to buck the established narrative in Southern history set him apart from the overwhelming majority of the white historians who preceded him. Yet, in his mind, surely, this attitude put him in the infinitely preferable company of William Faulkner, Thomas Wolfe, and Robert Penn Warren as part of the so-called generation of 1900, a distinguished cadre of gifted and independent-minded Southern writers born primarily between 1890 and 1910. This literary cohort had emerged near the end of the 1920s as modernist challengers to what was at heart a tightly scripted Victorian vision of past and present, and in the conjoined myths of New South gentility and New South progress. Woodward would step forward a decade later as a historian bent on doing much the same thing, and he readily acknowledged his profound indebtedness to Faulkner, Wolfe, and Warren for illustrating the presence of the past in the present and giving history such vivid meaning and value and significance as events never do merely because they happen. Southern historians, he advised, would do well to emulate their example. Meanwhile, Woodward's appreciation of the clarity and grace vital to an effective literary style became a hallmark of his own writing. Flannery O'Connor was hardly given to praising other Southern writers not named Faulkner. But after devouring the burden of Southern history, she reported to a friend that she had taken up reading C. Vann Woodward. Southern history usually gives me a pain, but this man knows how to write English. His dedication to clear and accessible writing surely served Woodward well as he led the way along with Schlesinger and Richard Hofstadter in reinvigorating public interest in history after World War II, harnessing it to new, more socially purposeful ends. In this regard, no aspect of Woodward's career looms larger than what it says about the importance of how historians perceive the very nature and obligations of their craft, particularly with respect to framing their treatments of the past with an eye to addressing the concerns of the present. In this, having grasped early on the cold Orwellian truth that who controls the past controls the future, Woodward was very much a historian on a mission. His propensity for fashioning alternative historical explanations into challenges to the status quo sometimes led him to play fast and loose with the evidence, not simply in The Strange Career of Jim Crow, but in his earlier historical monographs as well. His habitual resort to this practice in his earlier writings revealed determination to make the past not simply speak to the present, but encourage efforts to make it better. Such forays into historical presentism had long been seen as the peculiar province of so-called activist historians looking to challenge the legitimacy of the current order by offering a new, more critical vision of the past on which it rested. Woodward knew better, however, having realized early on that preceding generations of Southern historians had practiced their own more implicit brand of presentism in pursuit of precisely the opposite ends. By continually reinforcing a distinct historical narrative that effectively rationalized the abuses and inequities of the current order, they had fashioned the past into a shield against the kind of activist presentism that sought to rectify or eliminate these wrongs. In challenging their consistently recycled rather than revised version of the past meant to shore up the defenses of the present, Woodward had essentially inverted the purpose of writing Southern history by turning it into a force for change rather than a bulwark against it. He had done much the same in assailing the U.S. historians of the 1950s who uncritically ascribed their nation's material and military success to date to its innate genius and superior virtue, thereby nurturing a smugness and complacency that, if left unchallenged, might well lead to America's undoing. For all his good intentions, though, his tendency to allow his zeal for changing the present to color his interpretations of the past finally caught up with him within the scholarly realm, where many of the principal arguments offered in the 4 books he had written in the first 20 years of his career had effectively been taken to the historical woodshed well before his death in 1999. Yet, as with The Strange Career of Jim Crow, the critical scrutiny devoted to all of Woodward's historical monographs over the last half of the 20th century was, in a real sense, a tribute to the seminal importance of his contributions to scholarship during the first phase of his career. Indeed, the powerful and widespread impulse to test his arguments, evaluate his aims, methods, and assumptions, and follow up on the questions he raised was very nearly sufficient in and of itself to dynamize the study of Southern history since the Civil War for the better part of 2 generations. Even so, Woodward's story is no thoroughly heroic and triumphal narrative from beginning to end. Heavily invested through word and deed in the long battle for racial integration, he was sorely angered in the mid-1960s to see many younger blacks suddenly renouncing their aims and belittling, even undermining the hard-won achievements of the civil rights movement while embracing the ideal of black separatism. This anger, in turn, fueled his steadfast opposition to separate Black studies programs, while he saw multiculturalism in its various outcroppings running counter to America's historic commitment, as he put it, to e pluribus unum. Woodward's steadfast late career resistance to such developments arising on the left tempted some to stereotype him as yet another young liberal firebrand whose views shifted markedly to the right as he grew older. In reality, though, his fundamental stance on race relations, and cultural assimilation had remained remarkably consistent throughout his adult life. Beginning in the 1960s, what he saw on campus and beyond amounted to an outright rejection of some of his most deeply held beliefs. His bitterness at this disillusioning turn of events mounted in the face of the sustained emotional pounding he had suffered between 1969 and 1982, when he lost his only child, his three closest friends, and his wife. Sadder still, perhaps, the timing of these severe personal losses prevented him from savoring some of his greatest personal triumphs. The satisfaction of being chosen to lead both the Organization of American Historians and the American Historical Association in the same year evaporated in the misery of watching his 24-year-old son, Peter, suffer the final rages of the metastatic melanoma that would claim his life in September 1969. When he learned in April 1982 that he was to receive the Pulitzer Prize for his revised edition of the Civil War Diaries of Mary Borkett Chestnut, his wife, Glenn, was in the final weeks of her own struggle with cancer. He generally managed to keep his enduring grief over these personal losses at bay by committing himself to a work regimen more befitting an anxious assistant professor coming up for tenure. He was less successful in bottling up his anger over the direction of his profession and higher education in general, and his frustration at being unable to do much about it. His bruised ego got the better of him in his bitter campaign to prevent historian and high-profile Communist Party representative Herbert Aptheker from teaching an undergraduate seminar at Yale. Meanwhile, his righteous anger at what he saw as a tidal wave of political correctness engulfing college campuses also seemed to blur his judgment, as it did in his largely uncritical endorsement in 1991 of right-wing provocateur Dinesh D'Souza's sensationalized account of multiculturalism run amok on America's campuses. Still, there were few signs that such lapses in judgment, discretion, and self-control as marked the final decades of his long life and career significantly diminished his stature. When he died at age 91 in December 1999, the torrent of superlatives unloosed in eulogies, obituaries, and tributes from former students, as well as many who knew him only through his writing, marked the passing of someone of truly monumental importance. Yet surely the most meaningful and certainly the most moving tribute Woodward received came 2 months before his death in the form of a remarkable letter from Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. Knowing that Woodward had already spent several months in the hospital struggling to recover from major heart surgery and sensing that this might be his last chance to pay homage to his friend of 4 decades, Schlesinger penned what was more than anything a pre-mortem eulogy, and one surely as fitting and elegant as any offered upon Woodward's actual passing. As I contemplate your life, Schlesinger wrote, I hope you will realize how much you have meant to the historical profession. Your preeminence derives partly from the superb quality of your historical writing, but it derives as much from your human presence. Not only had Woodward led the way in upholding the standards of the historian's craft against the passing nostrums of the day, but to Schlesinger's mind, he had rendered even greater service as the conscience of our profession, as well as a vital source of moral leadership, which, he added, you have provided unassumingly, effectively, and courageously, and you've inspired younger scholars to do their resolute best to grapple with a mysterious past. Though his enthusiasm for making the past an instrument of change in the present led to an occasional departure from the professional standards, Schlesinger lauded him for upholding whatever might be said about Woodward's means. There's no quarreling with the end he pursued in trying to persuade everyday readers that the past could help them make better sense of the world in which their daily lives unfold. As Schlesinger observed, this lesson was surely not lost on several decades worth of aspiring historians, although there is no telling precisely how many of them were drawn to the profession over the better part of 2 generations by the exhilarating prospect of following Woodward's lead in drawing on their craft to make a difference in the here and now. Let's just say there's certainly one with whom I am pretty well acquainted. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Cobb. We have time for a few questions. It's a good time to point out to our online audience again, you can post your questions in the comment feature. We'll get to some of those as well. Dr. Vickery?
Dr. Cobb, I have read that Dr. King once said that the Strange Career was the Bible of the Civil Rights Movement. Are you familiar with that attributed quotation? And if you are, what do you think of it?
Well, as I indicated in the talk, according to both the film and the transcript of that talk, he did not say that at that point. He may have said it at some other point. But he clearly, he clearly knew of the book and found it relevant based on the other things he said. He did say about it in the speech.
Are you personally aware that he ever said that anywhere?
No. And I've searched, insofar as I've been able to, I've searched, to find an instance when he did.
Someone else in the audience?
I was just a little bit concerned, and sort of agreed with what Schlesinger was trying to say, I think, that, was he trying to say that interjecting morality into history poses a risk to objectivity?
He didn't, Schlesinger didn't say that. I said that, there sometimes that desire to, lend a moral dimension to what was learned from history led Woodward to fudge a little bit on the evidence and sort of take a little license with it. But Schlesinger didn't say that. I mean, he just it was everything he said was praising Woodward.
Give you credit for saying it. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, or discredit.
Someone else? Well, I have a question, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
You talked about some of the essays that Professor Woodward was writing in the late 1960s. One that I recall reading is Harper's 1967, What Happened to the Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah.
Are you aware of any responses that essay drew from either his friends in the historical community or movement leaders? Well,
people who agreed with him, not surprisingly, people who agreed with him, like Alfred A. Knopf, he wrote him immediately and commended him. And Woodward said, well, truth be told, he commended him for being so blunt in his criticism of this whole move away from integration as a goal of the civil rights movement. And Woodward said, well, I wrote that. I wrote that thing back 6 weeks ago. If I had to write it now, I'd be even more blunt and critical. Even Mr. Howard's letter there, I think, makes mention of that piece that was eventually included in a subsequent edition of The Burden of Southern History. But it pretty well, he was in his correspondence with his other kind of Southern liberals of his generation who. He shared the same impression back and forth with them, and they certainly shared the impressions he conveyed in that essay.
Any other questions?
So I was really entertained by the comments of Woodward as a graduate student,
Yeah.
and I thought we had just a really vivid depiction of that time. So was he a frequent diarist or letter writer? Where do those quotes and perspectives of his experiences come from?
Well, he thanks be to God, he maintained a steady correspondence with Glenn Rainey whom he had met at Emory. And Rainey, I tell you the truth. Rainey was, I'm not going to say he was as smart as Woodward or had the makings of nearly as good a scholar, but he was still dang smart. And if Woodward had taken his advice on several of the early things he wrote, he would have received less criticism for them ultimately. But poor Rainey was just, Woodward has, I mentioned it in the book, he said, "Oh, I'm so miserable that I'm mad at myself for being so miserable." And he just keeps telling Rainey, he says, "Oh, I'm going to see you back in Atlanta at Christmas, and I'm really going to unload on you then." And I'm sure Rainey thought, "Well, you mean you haven't already?" He just, he resented being there. He just didn't, he was young and he generally had things go his way up to that point, and then they would continue to for quite a while. So he just felt put upon because to him the most important thing was finishing that book on Watson. And he just resented the idea that he had to jump through all these hoops, put in front of him by people whom he did not really respect. But of course that made him part of that the material on that I found it made him a folk hero in the grad program at UNC. And there would be periodical mentions, or somebody wrote up this broadside describing Woodward, telling the faculty to buzz off, and how the greatest, by far the greatest historian ever to receive a PhD from the University of North Carolina, had kind of thumbed his nose at the requirements of the graduate program. So he lived on as part of a very very vivid local legend in those parts.
We have an online question from none other than Ed Bridges, our former director, who's watching from afar. He wants to know, Dr. Cobb, if you would talk about your personal relationship with Woodward, and then I guess tell us how you decided to come about writing this biography.
Oh, hey, Ed. And it won't take you long to tell about my personal relationship with Woodward, because it was more or less, it was more or less non-existent as a personal relationship. I was in his presence many times, but we just, I'd seen so many instances in meeting after meeting where people just rush all over him, run up to him, call him Vann and slap him on the back like they'd gone to grade school together. And he clearly had no idea who they were. And I just thought, when I was around him, man, he just deserves his space. And he was always very polite to me. And we carried on like conversation, but we never really got, I'd love to known if he ever read anything I wrote. I suspect he almost certainly read the two things I wrote about his work in the Journal of Southern History, but he never moved to do that. So and that didn't really bother me or affect me or offend me in the least. I just wanted to avoid being trampled in the stampede to get to him. But I did. The reason why I ultimately decided to write the book was that just what I've sort of been laying out, that he was such, when I started graduate school in 1969. I mean, he was just a ubiquitous presence, and you couldn't escape reading C. Vann Woodward. And if you wrote a paper, you couldn't escape quoting. He was just everywhere, and he was just such a and I mentioned in the book, but I'm not exaggerating. Well, not much, anyway. That about his effect on coming into a room, at a professional meeting. I mean, it just you could tell that the decibel level all kind of slumped when he entered the room, and so and then in Rice University announced a symposium to note the 50th anniversary of the publication of Origins of the New South, which would be in 2001. And so they invited me to give a talk, and I was a department chair then and desperate to not only get out of the office, get out of town. So I decided, what the heck, I'm going to go up. I know some of his Woodward's papers. He had just recently died, but I know some of his papers at least are available at Yale, and I just want to see what's up there. So, and I'd also discovered Rainey's papers at Emory, which were much more accessible. So it only took one trip to New Haven to persuade me that if I lived, I was going to write a book about Woodward, and the jury was out about whether I was going to live to finish it, but happily I did, or unhappily maybe for some.
Happily indeed. Another round of applause for our speaker today.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming.
The museum store does still have a few copies of the publication. If you're interested, I'm sure Dr. Cobb would be glad to sign it for you. We thank you all for coming today and look forward to seeing you next time. Be well, everybody.